The unraveling of Iran. Setting the stage for decades, Iran has been a nation defined by its contradictions. On the one hand, it boasts a rich history stretching back thousands of years, from the Persian Empire to the Islamic Republic that exists today. On the other, it has been struggling under the weight of political oppression, economic sanctions, and internal unrest. The world often sees Iran through the lens of its nuclear ambitions and geopolitical maneuvers. But beneath the surface, a much more fragile reality is emerging, a reality that threatens to pull the regime into a trap worth over $1 trillion. The current crisis gripping Iran is not sudden. It is the result of decades of mismanagement, corruption, and an increasingly authoritarian grip by the clerical leadership. The Iranian economy, once a regional powerhouse fueled by vast oil reserves, has been slowly eroded by systemic inefficiencies and international sanctions. Inflation has skyrocketed. Unemployment remains high. The currency has lost significant value against the dollar. Ordinary citizens, who once placed their hopes in reforms and promises of stability, now find themselves facing daily uncertainty, with many struggling to afford basic necessities. Political control in Iran has traditionally been maintained through a combination of strict law enforcement, ideological indoctrination, and suppression of dissent. The regime relies heavily on paramilitary forces, such as the Basij and the Revolutionary Guard, to maintain order and deter public protests. Yet, over recent years, the effectiveness of these tactics has begun to wane. Mass protests have erupted in multiple cities, often sparked by seemingly small triggers, such as the sudden rise in fuel prices or the death of a young woman in police custody. These protests are not isolated events. They reflect a deeper dissatisfaction with the status quo and a population that increasingly refuses to accept the old rules. At the heart of this unrest lies a generational shift. Iran's youth, who make up over half the population, are growing up in a world vastly different from the one experienced by their parents. With access to the internet and social media, they are exposed to global ideas, lifestyles, and opportunities. This exposure has created a population that is less willing to accept rigid religious edicts and more inclined to demand political accountability and personal freedom. Despite government attempts to restrict online platforms, Iranians have consistently found ways to bypass censorship, amplifying voices of dissent and spreading news of protests to a global audience. Economically, Iran is facing what experts are calling a structural collapse. The country's oil-dependent economy has been severely affected by international sanctions aimed at curtailing its nuclear program and regional influence. These sanctions have restricted Iran's ability to export oil, limited access to global financial systems, and deterred foreign investment. While the government has attempted to develop domestic industries and alternative trade partnerships, these measures have been insufficient to offset the loss of revenue. The result is a growing gap between the ruling elite and ordinary citizens, fueling anger and resentment. The $1 trillion trap is not just a metaphor. It reflects the staggering potential cost of Iran's internal instability on the global stage. Analysts estimate that the collapse of Iran as economic and political structure could trigger ripple effects across the Middle East and beyond. Neighboring countries might face refugee crises, global oil prices could spike, and international markets could experience turbulence. For the regime, this is a literal and figurative trap. Maintaining control requires suppressing dissent at enormous cost, while failing to adapt could result in the complete erosion of their power base. Another critical factor in Iran's weakening grip is the role of external actors. The United States, European powers, and regional rivals like Saudi Arabia and Israel have all applied pressure on Tehran, using sanctions, diplomatic isolation, and covert operations to challenge the regime. While these external pressures have contributed to Iran's economic woes, they have also inadvertently fueled nationalist rhetoric within the country. The regime often portrays external criticism as interference in Iranian sovereignty, attempting to rally public support around the banner of national pride. However, even with this strategy, the internal cracks are widening, and public trust in leadership continues to decline. Inside the corridors of power, tensions are escalating as well. The ruling elite is divided between hardliners who advocate for stricter control and resistance to reform, and pragmatists who recognize the need for economic and social concessions to maintain stability. This internal power struggle weakens decision-making and creates uncertainty for foreign partners. Investors and allies hesitate, unsure of which faction will ultimately dictate policy. This indecision amplifies the sense of crisis both within Iran and internationally, reinforcing the idea that the regime is losing its once iron grip. Social unrest in Iran is increasingly tied to fundamental grievances, including corruption, inequality, and lack of opportunity. Government officials often enjoy privileges far beyond those of ordinary citizens, fueling resentment and anger. Reports of lavish lifestyles among politicians contrast sharply with the daily struggles of the population, further eroding legitimacy. When people perceive the system as inherently unfair, even minor grievances can spark widespread protests. This phenomenon has played out repeatedly over the last few years, with demonstrations spreading quickly across cities and provinces, often outpacing the regime's capacity to respond effectively. In addition to economic and political pressures, cultural factors are contributing to the regime's vulnerability. Iran's rich cultural history, while a source of national pride, also serves as a reminder of the country's potential. Citizens compare current hardships with the achievements of past generations and question why contemporary leaders fail to harness the nation's resources effectively. Artistic expression, literature, and media, both domestic and international, highlight the contrast between potential and reality, subtly challenging the narrative imposed by the authorities. The regime's responses and the escalating crisis. As Iran faces mounting internal and external pressures, the ruling regime has been forced into a series of reactive and often contradictory measures. On one hand, the government seeks to maintain strict control over the population through security forces and surveillance. On the other, it recognizes the need to address economic grievances and prevent widespread collapse. This balancing act is becoming increasingly impossible, as each decision seems to create more problems than it solves. The $1 trillion trap is no longer a distant threat. It is materializing in real time, with consequences for both Iran and the global system. One of the regime's primary tools for maintaining control has been the Revolutionary Guard Corps. Alongside other paramilitary forces, these groups are tasked with monitoring the population, suppressing protests, and intimidating opposition figures. While they have historically been effective in containing dissent, recent events suggest that their influence is waning. Protests are no longer confined to major cities. They are spreading to smaller towns, demonstrating that the government's reach is being challenged. Social media, often accessed through VPNs and encrypted messaging apps, allow citizens to document and share these events internationally, creating embarrassment for the authorities and increasing global scrutiny. Economic interventions by the government have also failed to stabilize the situation. Attempts to control inflation, regulate currency, and provide subsidies for essential goods have been only partially successful. Mismanagement and corruption continue to undermine these efforts, with resources often diverted to politically connected elites rather than ordinary citizens. The result is that public frustration remains high, with many Iranians feeling that the government prioritizes its own survival over the welfare of the population. This perception fuels protests and further erodes legitimacy, creating a cycle of unrest that the regime struggles to break. International sanctions have exacerbated these challenges. While the regime often portrays sanctions as unfair attacks on Iranian sovereignty, their economic impact cannot be ignored. Restrictions on oil exports, banking, and trade have reduced government revenues, limited foreign investment, and made it harder for ordinary citizens to access essential goods. Despite efforts to establish alternative trade partnerships with countries like China and Russia, these measures are insufficient to offset the losses incurred from sanctions imposed by the United States and European nations. The regime's inability to navigate these sanctions effectively demonstrates its growing vulnerability. Meanwhile, internal power struggles within the ruling elite are intensifying. Hardliners, who advocate for strict enforcement of ideological principles, clash with pragmatists pushing for reforms to stabilize the economy and quell unrest. This infighting slows decision-making and increases uncertainty for both domestic and international actors. Investors, foreign governments, and even regional allies hesitate to engage with Iran, unsure of which faction truly controls policy. The lack of unified leadership further amplifies the perception that the regime is losing control, making it harder to implement coherent strategies in response to mounting crises. The social dimensions of the crisis cannot be overlooked. Women, youth, and marginalized communities are increasingly at the forefront of protests, challenging both traditional norms and the government's authority. High-profile incidents, such as the death of young women in custody, have ignited nationwide outrage, highlighting broader issues of injustice and inequality. These events are more than isolated tragedies. They represent deep-seated frustrations with systemic oppression and the lack of meaningful avenues for political expression. As protests gain momentum, the regime is forced into a defensive position, responding with temporary concessions or violent suppression, both of which have proven to be insufficient solutions. Economic collapse is another possibility, and perhaps the most dangerous for both Iran and the global system. With sanctions restricting trade, oil revenues declining, and internal corruption rampant, the government's financial reserves are under extreme pressure. Should essential services fail or the currency devalue further, public outrage could escalate beyond protests into widespread civil disobedience or even insurgency. For a nation whose oil exports influence global markets, any disruption could lead to spikes in energy prices, affecting everything from gas prices in Europe and the US to supply chains across Asia. The $1 trillion trap would then become tangible, representing not only domestic instability, but worldwide economic consequences. geopolitical ramifications cannot be underestimated. Neighboring states and regional powers are carefully monitoring Iran's trajectory. Saudi Arabia, Israel, and the United Arab Emirates all stand to gain from a weakened Iran, whether through political leverage, territorial influence, or market advantage. At the same time, global powers like the United States, Russia, and China face complex decisions. Intervening directly could stabilize the country in the short term, but risks long-term entanglement. Remaining passive allows instability to fester, potentially disrupting energy markets and regional security. The uncertainty surrounding Iran forces the international community to consider worst-case scenarios, making the $1 trillion trap a truly global concern. The human cost of these scenarios is immense. Millions of Iranians face the dual burden of economic hardship and political repression. Families struggle to afford basic necessities. Young people see limited opportunities for the future. And communities are torn between loyalty to the nation and anger at the regime. Migration is likely to increase, with citizens seeking refuge in neighboring countries or further abroad. This population movement can create strain on regional infrastructure, resources, and international relations, amplifying the consequences of Iran's internal crisis. Technology continues to reshape the battlefield. Citizens increasingly rely on digital platforms to organize, communicate, and document abuses. The regime's efforts to restrict information have become less effective, with VPNs, encrypted messaging apps, and international media providing alternatives. This digital empowerment transforms protests into coordinated movements, difficult for authorities to fully suppress. In this sense, technology acts as both a shield and a weapon for citizens, giving them tools to challenge authority in ways previous generations could not. The regime's inability to control these channels further exposes its vulnerability. Cultural factors also play a critical role. Iranian society is rich in history, art, and intellectual traditions, fostering a population that values expression, debate, and accountability. Citizens increasingly measure their government against these cultural ideals, noting discrepancies between national potential and current realities. This awareness fuels dissatisfaction and contributes to a growing demand for systemic change. The state-S attempts to control narratives through propaganda are increasingly ineffective against the tide of cultural and intellectual dissent. In terms of foreign policy, Iran's ability to project influence in the region is diminishing. Proxy conflicts in Syria, Lebanon, and Yemen drain resources, while international attention focuses on internal instability. Allies may begin reevaluating their commitments, and adversaries could exploit weaknesses. The regime's reduced capacity to act abroad not only affects regional dynamics, but signals to the population that leadership is faltering, further eroding confidence in the state. So, what does the future hold? While predictions are inherently uncertain, one thing is clear. The Iranian regime is facing pressures unlike any it has experienced in decades. The combination of economic instability, social unrest, generational demands, internal divisions, and international pressure creates a situation that cannot be managed by traditional authoritarian methods alone. Whether through collapse, reform, or prolonged tension, the trajectory of Iran in the coming months will have consequences felt far beyond its borders. For global observers, the $1 trillion trap represents both risk and opportunity. Investors, policymakers, and analysts must carefully weigh the potential for disruption against the possibility of stabilization. Energy markets, regional security frameworks, and diplomatic alliances will all need to adapt to Iran's evolving situation. The cost of misjudging the trajectory of the Iranian regime is not merely financial. It could reshape the geopolitical balance of the Middle East and beyond. In conclusion, Iran-ECOWAS current crisis illustrates the fragility of power when it is disconnected from the needs and aspirations of its people. The $1 trillion trap is a stark reminder that economic, social, and political pressures are interconnected. The regime's inability to address these pressures holistically is driving the nation toward uncertainty, with potential consequences that extend far beyond its borders. As citizens continue to demand change and external actors watch closely, the decisions made in Tehran will shape not only Iran's future, but the stability of an entire region. The Iranian regime is at a pivotal moment. Its choices in the coming months, whether to reform, repress, or maintain the status quo, will determine whether it survives, collapses, or transforms. What is undeniable is that the stakes are enormous, both domestically and globally. The $1 trillion Iran trap is not a theoretical concept. It is unfolding before our eyes, and the world is watching. Thank you for watching this deep dive into the $1 trillion Iran trap. If you found this video insightful, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell to stay updated on the latest geopolitical analyses. Your support helps us continue uncovering the hidden forces shaping our world.